It's the week ending Saturday, the 7th of April, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen gender pay gaps revealed in British business, rail workers striking in France, and the trade war intensify between China and the US. But we're here to bring you some of the stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And with me from the week's digital team are Holden, Frith, Arion, McNicoll and Rebecca Gillie. And starting the show this week is Rebecca. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
There's a Syria-scale crisis going on in the heart of Africa.
Even if the election itself will take place, it's already been postponed twice. It should have taken place in 2016, and it did not. Recently, protests for Joseph Kabila to make his position clear whether or not he will step down have ended in a bloodbath. So now the whole question is to know whether Kabila will try to seek to modify the constitution and seek a third term, or whether he will accept to step down and a successor to come after him.
Daniel Hoffman reporting this week outside the UN in New York for France 24. So, Rebecca, there's a deepening humanitarian crisis in the DRC, as we've just heard. Joseph Kabila's the president. Should he be the one sorting this out?
Well, the problem is really that he is the president, because his term actually expired in December 2016. But he's been clinging on to power since then, and he's said several times, yes, there's definitely going to be some elections. He's now saying there's going to be elections in December of this year. And all this political uncertainty has really escalated the situation. I mean, the Democratic Republic of the Congo has been a hotspot for conflict, militia violence, displacement of its own people for, a really long time now. But it has now got significantly worse. There is a lot of militia violence in the east and southeast of the country. Millions of people have been displaced. A lot of them have gone to Uganda, which now has, I think it's got the highest number of refugees of any African country. And the biggest UN peacekeeping force in the world is now stationed in the DRC, which is 16,000 people trying to keep the peace.
Okay, so how bad is the situation at the moment? Is it as bad as Yemen, or you said in your introduction, Syria?
Yeah, it's been compared to
it's as bad as Syria.
Humanitarian crisis in Syria. There are 5 million people who've been displaced from their homes, 13 million people the UN estimates are in need of humanitarian aid, and 7.7 million are experiencing severe food insecurity, which means regularly going without food on a daily basis. Okay.
I mean, I don't like this trope we often have, and we fall into this trap, I guess, of saying, well, why isn't the media reporting it? It's very important because we're not here to discuss the media. But why is this not getting the coverage that Syria has? Arion?
I think one of the problems with getting coverage out of the DRC is that the fighting is often in very remote parts of the country. It's very unsafe for journalists to even be there. It's much smaller scale day to day, and so it's quite hard for journalists to get to the fighting and then to get reports out. And also because of the slightly repetitive nature of the way that the fighting unfolds, I think that the stories are often even 2 weeks late by the time they're discovered. So it's just very hard to report on the conflict.
I suppose as well, I mean, it's maybe of less relevance to other countries, grimly. I mean, obviously it matters to Uganda, as you were just saying, Rebecca, but it's not perhaps like Syria where you can say, oh, what does this mean for the US? What does it mean for Lebanon? What does it mean for Israel? I mean, with the DRC, people are sort of used to expecting it to be a bit of a basket case.
Yeah, and that's the DRC's history in a nutshell, really, is that it has been overlooked for so long. And it's ever since, because it was formerly Zaire, a Belgian colony, ever since independence, it hasn't had a single democratic transition of power. And I think it's just been riven by violence so long that people have actually, especially in the West, turned a blind eye to what's going on there and the scale of the horror, really.
Holden, why is the Democratic Republic of Congo in this mess in the first place?
That is a very big question. You can answer it in lots of different ways. I mean, the immediate history, if we're looking back, say, 20 years, the Congolese wars of the late 90s actually were almost a spin-off from the Rwandan genocide. And as a result of that violence, a lot of people flowed over the border into Congo, some of those victims and others perpetrators. And the new Rwandan government, seeking the perpetrators, then invaded what was then Zaire in response to the feeling that the Zairean government was actually preparing those militia for invasion of Rwanda. The resulting violence was partly a response to that invasion, but also it was a kind of surfacing of ethnic tensions underlying Zairean society that dated back to the colonial era, and that the sort of arbitrary drawing of lines on a map.
And that colonial history, is that part of the reason why perhaps there hasn't been a discussion in the West about getting involved? I mean, I'm sure there has at the United Nations and whatever, but I mean, as part of a broad consensual discussion.
The history of Congo is, in a crowded field of African countries with terrible histories, Congo, Zaire, probably has the most horrific and most brutal. It was ruled not actually as a Belgian colony, but as a personal fiefdom of King Leopold II. So there wasn't even the 19th century standard of parliamentary oversight reining him in. He basically tried to extract as much wealth as he possibly could from the country.
Because they have a lot of minerals and stuff there, don't they?
Yes, they do. At that time, it was actually rubber that was the key resource. This was late 19th century. Bikes and cars were beginning to catch on. Invention of the pneumatic tyre generated huge demand for rubber. And Congo, as it then was the biggest source of that. King Leopold II needed cash to pay for various mistresses that he had, and so he instituted the most horrific slave labour conditions. At one point, he was concerned that soldiers working for him were wasting ammunition, so he introduced a rule that for every bullet fired, a soldier had to present a human hand as evidence that it had been successfully used. So soldiers would carry around baskets full of hands with them as they were out in the countryside, and then present them for accounting at the end of their tour of duty.
I mean, that is particularly grim, but you're going back over 100 years.
That's true.
Is there a reason that the DRC is still living in the shadow of that?
This is really a pattern that's repeated itself time and time again. So after independence, during the Cold War, Zaire, as it then became, was one of the biggest sources of uranium. So the US and Belgium, to a certain extent, were really keen to keep the new post-independence government in line with the West rather than with Soviet Union. Patrice Lumumba, the first post-independence prime minister, started to tilt towards Moscow, and with the connivance really of the CIA and Belgian secret services, he was deposed and executed by local militia under the supervision of Belgian soldiers. This led to the installment a few years later of Mobutu Sese Seko, who was one of the most brutal and corrupt African dictators. During this period, other minerals started to become more important, particularly cobalt and coltan, which are used in production of mobile phones. Mobutu is accused of embezzling somewhere between $4 billion and $15 billion US dollars during his 30 years in office. And when he was deposed as a result of the violence following the Rwandan genocide, as is the case when a lot of strongmen leaders are deposed, all of these simmering tensions erupted. The mineral wealth of the country has since been fueling that kind of intercommunal violence that's riven the country.
Because it's partly on the black market and being operated by warlords and stuff.
Well, yeah, so cobalt is basically the latest example of how what should have been the DRC's many mineral blessings have actually turned out to be a curse. The Kabila family heavily invested in the state cobalt mining corporation, which doesn't actually do much mining anymore. They sell a lot of permits to third parties. Foreign companies. A lot of the cobalt was purchased by China.
And to be clear, you mentioned, Holden, that this is in a lot of phones. It's actually in every phone, isn't it? Like if you've got a smartphone on your lap now or in your pocket, if you're listening to us through it, you're using cobalt. Yeah,
and Apple buys a huge amount of it
so
from the DRC.
Sort of by rights be one of the richest countries in Africa.
Yeah, of course. But the estimate, I got this from an article by Quartz, is that only 6% of the revenue from cobalt mined in the DRC actually goes into the national coffers. If you compare that somewhere like Saudi Arabia or any of the oil-rich Middle Eastern countries, it's crazy. Really, the citizens of the DRC should be experiencing that level of wealth, but instead, it's one of the poorest countries in Africa, and the UN estimates there are 40,000 children working in cobalt mines. There's been a couple of high-profile investigations recently. I think one was by CBS and one was by Sky News, where they went and they found children as young as 4 just being beaten and abused by overseers and picking through piles of cobalt to mine the mineral that's going to be used for our
Isn't
phones.
there corporate responsibility that could be taken for that then, Arion, in the West? I mean, obviously there's not much we can do about civil tensions. There's not much we can do about their elections, I guess, without getting involved in a war or through the UN. But we can say to Apple and Samsung and whoever, take account of your logistical chain.
I think that's true. What the companies that are operating in the DRC tend to say is that because they're working in a really complicated and dangerous environment, they don't want to have to take on any more financial responsibility than they already have done. So they sort of feel as though their responsibility ends at the point where they get involved in, say, mining the country in the first place. But I think that question of where the money ends up is a really important one. And so many of the elite from the DRC tend to live outside of the country in the first place. And it's really unclear where most of those flows of cash even go. We know that a lot of it tends to go via Jersey, Gibraltar and the BVI and so on, but we don't actually know where it ends up. And one of the solutions that was being proposed by an interesting discussion I heard on the Frontline Club was to really just follow that trail of money. If we want to find out how to solve the problem in the first place, we need to work out where the money goes and then go from there. And I think that that's probably the first step that's necessary.
And on Wednesday, it was reported that the opposition leader there may be barred from elections on grounds that he may have Italian citizenship. Is there any positive outcome from the elections in December?
Well, there was a recent poll that showed that 9 out of 10 Congolese disapprove of President Kabila. Not surprising, seeing as he's now outstayed his welcome by 2 years. But 7 out of 10 said that they didn't think that the elections in December would be fair. And the government has also recently hinted that they think they may not be able to afford to hold the elections. So let's wait and see.
OK, Arion, you're up next. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
A Swede and his money are soon parted.
I personally never use cash. As you see here, I'm shopping. I use my scanner. When I check out, I'll use my credit card, and my banking I do on my iPhone. So that's it. I don't need any cash.
And in Sweden, only around 3% of all transactions are now made with cash.
Linda Neerberg reporting for Al Jazeera. Now, that was back in 2012, but Arion, presumably your story this week is that Sweden have done it. They're now a cashless society.
Getting there, and not quite, but certainly getting there.
So what happened?
So this week there was an opinion poll that revealed that 7 out of 10 Swedes actually want to keep cash after having been in this kind of movement towards being completely cashless. As recently as 2010, 40%, which is still quite low, of transactions were being made with cash. And this year, it's now around the sort of 15% mark. So it's heading in that direction, but the most recent survey found that Swedes are now resisting that movement and they want to go back in the other direction.
So they're resisting it psychologically, but their action still suggests that eventually it might become a cashless society anyway, just by action.
Yeah, and actually it's funny to see the way that consumers tend to often behave in different ways to the way that they say that they're going to behave. And I think that one of the things that drives cashlessness forward in not just Sweden but other parts of the world is its convenience. And it's convenience that means that people give away their information to Facebook and Google, and it's convenience that means that they choose to buy apples with their
apple,
to touch with their apple, rather than with coins. And so I think that yes, people are certainly still going in that direction, but I think there is a growing sense that maybe it's not the right direction to be going.
And why Sweden? Is this the secret story that I hadn't noticed, Holden? Is Sweden the South Korea of Europe? Are they further ahead than us on cashlessness?
Yes, apparently so. It does seem to be something that the Swedish government has quite actively pursued and has encouraged retailers and consumers to shun cash wherever possible and use digital alternatives and cards. And I wondered whether this sort of alleged backlash was actually more a sort of psychological effect of how the question had been phrased in the opinion poll. Like, if you ask people, do you want to lose the option to pay in cash? It's quite easy to say yes. But it seems that given the option of paying either in cash or by card, everyone's choosing cards.
Some people would say there is no problem with a cashless society because if you've got nothing to hide, it doesn't matter that your every purchase is being tracked.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not surprised at all about the results of this survey because I think we are starting to see a real backlash. You know, the Cambridge Analytica is just the latest in a series of scandals that show us that our personal data is not necessarily being protected by big corporations. And I think our bank accounts, our finances are probably the things that we would most be worried about. keeping secure online. And
Is it more secure to pay in cash, though?
I think people are really starting to push back against the idea that everything that we do can be tracked by companies, and the idea that all your purchases can be tallied together and then sold off to a third party who can serve you ads. There have always been fears, I think was sort of dismissed as hidebound fears of fuddy-duddies. You think about your grandparents that don't want to buy anything online because they think that if you enter your card details, they'll be immediately snatched. But now, rather than just the security of your bank details, we're seeing people who are actually really taking against, from a psychological perspective, the idea that we're being tracked and monitored at all times, and companies building up this picture of us.
I agree with that in the abstract, but I just find the convenience of paying by card, buying things online, overrides any security fears I may have.
But it's a choice.
It is.
And if
that's
it wasn't
true.
anymore. I mean, what people are saying is, the thing about Sweden, and it's interesting this is coming out of Sweden, but the thing about Sweden is they have a relatively benign, kind of liberal, open-minded government, don't they? But you can look at other countries in Europe, Ireland, where abortion is illegal, or Hungary, where there are all kinds of rules that appear to clamp down on freedom of religion. And you'd think, well, if I was a citizen there and the government got more extreme, it's restricting my choice if the government say, we're going to look through your credit card records and see what you've been spending your money on.
On that point, there's one of the most vocal groups on this question is an organisation called Contantupproret, or the Cash Rebellion, and they warned that basically if all of your transactions are cashless rather than with hard currency, then you really are exposed. And Sweden has long felt that it is fairly or unfairly on the front line of a conflict of some kind with Russia. And the example that the head of this Contantupproret gave was, what if Gotland, the biggest island in Sweden, was overtaken by Putin, and then he just switched off access to bank accounts, and there was no currency. And I think there is this.
Last week we were turning off satellites.
Yeah, but I think that
turn off this week. It's going to be a continuing segment.
But I think there is that fear that even if it's not our government, that if there was someone else in charge or something happened, then cash becomes important.
Or more
again.
realistically, just a hacker messing about. I mean, that's what's been happening, isn't
Well,
it?
we're moving, I think, quite unconsciously. We're just moving further and further into this intangible future where everything's online. And I think sometimes we do lose track of the fact that it is quite fragile. If it was switched off, there's nothing to resort to.
I didn't quite necessarily agree with the point he was making, because it feels to me that sort of digital infrastructure is so far embedded in banking system and everything else that if Putin or any other £200 hacker in the bedroom was able to get into the systems, the payment systems, and stop digital payments, they'd also be able to get into the ATMs and stop cash being distributed or handed out in that way. And we've seen computer glitches in UK banks. NatWest has had problems on a couple of occasions where it's been unable to issue cash through machines. So I'm not sure really that there's actually quite the distinction between cash payments and bank card payments in that sense of information security.
Sort of, but yes, if you turned off an ATM, you can't get at cash. But if you'd been hoarding cash under your bed for 5 years, then you'd have access to that even in the
But that's
worst
become
case
an
scenario.
unfashionable thing to say, hasn't it? You sound now in a way that you wouldn't have 10 years ago, like a bit of a lunatic if you say, make sure you've got a couple of £1,000 at home in cash in case. I mean, you just sound like, what? Why would you,
Yeah,
and I collect all of my cards.
A few years ago, I'd probably, on average, have £50 or £60 cash on me at any point.
And now if someone mugged you today on the way out the building?
I don't have it. I think I have something like 17 pence in a pocket somewhere. I have no notes
Don't
on
bother.
me.
And that's because every coffee you buy with contactless cards.
Yeah. Contactless has been the key. I think previously it felt slightly antisocial to pay for a small sort of less than £5 with a card.
Because it takes a minute.
Keep her huffing at you.
Yeah.
Although I have to say, this is very London-centric in the sense that I was
How
in
dare
I
you
was in a
make
pub
that allegation
in
against this show,
the great
Rebecca.
British city of Stoke-on-Trent
Yeah.
a few weeks ago.
I know it
I
not
went-
well, but I've been.
I went to pay. This was shout out to the Jolly Potters. Went to pay at the bar. It was not a £5 or sub £5 transaction. It was
Yeah.
about £14 because I bought about 6 drinks, obviously. And the man just said, "We do not take card." And there was just a standoff. I had literally not a single penny on me. Luckily, someone I was with was able to swoop in with a £20 note. But I was just like, in London, as Holden was saying, I wouldn't think twice about paying for even the most minor purchase with my card. Even my contact list feels a bit old-fashioned because all my friends are using Apple Pay or what have you.
The real sign that's a story from beyond London is that you got 6 drinks for £14.
Yeah, exactly.
Even a slight exaggeration. It's probably worth the inconvenience of paying in cash.
Well, we're going to move on to having the equivalent of shots in this podcast now because it's our final story. We tend to lighten up at this point, Holden. What delightful treat are you getting us at the bar?
I've been looking into a literary border dispute.
I think what stands out about this long list is its variety, the energy of the many voices that we have, voices that take in politics and sexual politics, history and the contemporary, human relations and relations with mountains.
The judging process has been really enjoyable, actually. Very collegial, very pleasant. Even when we've disagreed, we've managed to do so with a lot of humour.
Long list is balanced without trying to be. It takes English to places where it hasn't necessarily been before.
Lisa Apignesi, chair of the judges for the Man Booker Prize this year, along with her fellow judges Hari Kunzru and Michael Hoffman. Holden, what's been going on?
At its narrowest, this is an argument about the entry criteria for a literary prize.
Okay, it didn't sound like an argument. It sounded very benevolent. What's been going on?
This is a dispute that dates back a few years now. 4 years ago, the Man Booker Prize opened its doors to any author writing in English. Previously, you were only eligible if you were a citizen of either the Commonwealth, including the UK, or Ireland. Mm-hmm. Those rules were changed. The main effect of the change was that American authors were eligible. That created a bit of a backlash at the time, particularly from UK and Commonwealth authors who felt they were going to be squeezed out. But everyone went on with their lives, and we'd kind of forgotten about it, unless we were one of those concerned authors, until this week, when a group of 250 authors who together are known as the Folio Academy were surveyed about whether they thought the rules should change back, and 99% of them said yes.
Oh.
Americans should no longer be eligible. We should go back to the old rules for the Booker Prize.
Big names on that list, I presume?
Yep, including several former Booker Prize winners, Martin Amis, Salman Rushdie among them.
Wow, that sounds quite restrictive, does it not? This is basically the principle that if you're writing in English, you should be eligible for a prize that rewards English writing. What's wrong with that?
And I think that was the original argument in favour of opening it up to America. Some critics have pointed out that really the idea of opening it to UK, Commonwealth, Ireland was kind of restricting the prize unnecessarily into a block based on, the British Empire, essentially, which are no longer particularly relevant. And as you say, there's no real strong justification for saying this prize is open to anyone writing in the English language unless they happen to be in the USA. However, there is, I think, the counterpoint to be made that Americans have kind of culturally swamped lots of other areas, films, TV, etc. American culture has kind of come to push out local cultures in lots of ways. So there is kind of an ongoing concern that's been around for decades that America is taking everything over, and can't we have anything for ourselves, and what's going to happen to our authors if America is allowed to seep in?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the problems, that we're just going to see American authors winning from here on out. And the second problem...
But doesn't Britain have a disproportionate influence, actually, of writing and thought in the English language? I know it's our language.
We've already seen a couple of US winners, even since they changed 2 years ago.
Okay, but North America is the biggest English-speaking country in the world. They have a massive culture in every kind of way, and a massive sort of show business, for want of a better phrase.
Sure.
The fact that British authors can compete at all, the fact that you have a completely fair competition and there are British authors nominated year after year, surely that speaks to the quality of British writing, whether they win or not.
Yeah, but America already has its own literary prizes as well. And if you think of prizes having a function of being able to expose new writing, then why not limit one to even a more provincial part of the world, if you're going to say that, certainly scale-wise, and offer the opportunity to surface more books to a greater audience.
But then you're the problem, aren't you? You Commonwealthers. If that's the purpose, if the purpose is to highlight great British writing, then it should be the Man Booker Prize for the best book from Britain. This Commonwealth idea is what started the slippery slope, if that's your argument, isn't it?
Maybe, and maybe you then just need to set up more local specific prizes if you're going down that direction. I'm kind of reiterating a criticism rather than mounting it personally.
But I think part of the reason that that this debate has become so fraught is because books and publishing do not get that kind of mainstream attention that television, films, etc. do. It's not as simple as saying, well, we'll start a new book prize. The whole weight of the Man Booker Prizes, it's one of the few literary prizes that the average person has heard of and that the average person might take seriously. So, it's no surprise that the debates around who's eligible and who's going to be highlighted in that award is creating such a stir, because there isn't actually that much mainstream attention to go around, and there's a lot of people who want it.
The reason I picked this story as one I thought was significant enough to merit its place on the podcast was I think it does tap into a much broader argument about cultural identity, national identity, and whether it's even possible to have a distinctive national voice anymore, or whether it will be as an increasing number of books, films, TV programs, records are produced either under the auspices of international companies or just have to compete in this increasingly global marketplace. I think at this particular moment when Brexit is looming, we're thinking about how Britain exists in the world in relation to Europe, to the Commonwealth, to the US, whether a sort of shift in the balance of political and economic power towards the Atlantic rather than across the Channel might mean that actually culturally we start to tilt even further in that direction too.
But America is the biggest cultural influence on our culture, isn't it? So, why not acknowledge that?
It is, but I think you were touching earlier on the fact that British novelists have generally held their own against American novelists. And I think we have almost taken for granted the idea of a national culture in Britain because it's something we've generally been quite good at. And whether it's theatre, books, music, TV, there's always been the feeling that there is a very strong British voice in those fields. But I wonder whether we're starting to feel a little bit more anxious about that, and with good reason. There was a report last week that I think it was 16 to 24-year-olds now spend more time watching Netflix than the BBC. And I think the BBC has been one of the engines of that culture, not just in TV, but in sort of hosting a national conversation about arts more generally. If this fragmentation of the audience into largely American-dominated, or perhaps in the future Chinese-dominated industries continues, it will be much harder to sort of maintain that cultural identity.
Is it snobbery, though?
Possibly.
Because some of the things that I've seen have basically said, well, the problem with all these American winners is they're just so bloody readable.
Well, that's another one of the big conflicts that's been going on around the Booker Prize is the move towards
books people like.
Books, exactly. That's what it is in a nutshell. The debate over whether we should be prizing literary qualities or readability that might appeal to the average person has led to a splinter prize, the Rathbones Folio Award, which was set up basically in response to the idea that the Booker Prize nominees were starting to be dominated by readable books that you could really zip through.
Yeah, except I saw the nominees for that this year, and Elizabeth Strout's on it, and she's really readable. And she's American.
She should have been disqualified.
She should have been disqualified immediately.
When the rules were initially changed, I was in favour of this opening up. It seemed like a natural thing to do. But I've actually come around, as you probably sensed from what I've been saying, I've kind of come around to the argument that actually there was a distinctive quality to Booker Prize list the past, and I actually although it's really hard to justify the sort of slightly odd criteria of Ireland, the UK, Commonwealth, those books did seem to have some sort of sense of English-speaking peoples talking to each other, and the US is it has a different culture, different history, different sort of, talk about the great American novel in the way you wouldn't necessarily talk about a great British novel or a great Australian novel. But I think
I'd argue that's because of the snobbishness of Oxford and Cambridge and literary criticism of the last 50 years, not because that should be the case.
That may be so, but I think there was still a value.
You can't honestly say, Harold Pinter's more important than Tennessee Williams. it's just, they just happen to be in different countries.
But I think there still was a value of having that sort of community feel to the Booker Prize. And I think, we were talking earlier about the difficulty of getting people interested in conflict in Democratic Republic of Congo. And I think that's partly because we don't have the stories to tell. We don't have kind of culture that has any connection with the Democratic Republic of Congo, whereas we do have those connections with India and South Africa, and it's partly through works by Arundhati Roy or Nadim Gordon or J.M. Coetzee. And I think that those sort of cultural ties are important in giving us a way into culture that isn't just news headlines.
But The God of Small Things would have won anyway, wouldn't it? Whether American novels were submitted that year or not. That's my point.
It may well have done, but I think the fear of a lot of publishers and authors is that in making it open to all. It's essentially narrowed it down to British and American authors, and that a lot of the up-and-coming Commonwealth authors who previously did get a good shot at winning the Booker are going to be crowded out.
And it does draw attention to, the question that we're kind of facing, as you were saying earlier, with Brexit. What is Britain's sphere going to be in the future? Is it moving close to the US, or is it falling back into those kind of outdated colonial ties with the Commonwealth, who increasingly aren't particularly interested in being, overseen by us culturally?
But they might like to win a prize now and again.
Do you actually go and check out Booker Prize nominees? When you see the list, does it make a difference to your
Strictly
reading
Richard
habits?
and Judy.
Yeah, that's your list. Arion?
Yeah, definitely. And certainly we'll follow not only because we're working on a website and we need to cover it, but I'll certainly check out those books, in spite of the fact that I know that it's a marketing tool to sell more novels. But yeah, I'll definitely check it out.
Yeah, I do always have a look at the list. And I know also that a lot of American authors and publishers also looked at the Booker list and were looking there for a list of great books published by non-Americans, and there's been some complaints even from America that actually this has led to a homogenization of literary world.
Okay, well, that is it from this edition of The Week Unwrapped. We will be back next time with more analysis of the week's news from a non-American British and Commonwealth perspective. My thanks to Rebecca Gillie, Holden Frith and Arion McNicoll. If you like the show, then please take a moment to rate, review and subscribe to it on your podcast app. That really helps other people find the show as well. And for more from us at The Week, why not visit theweek.co.uk, where you can also sign up to our free email newsletter, The Weekday, or you can have the magazine delivered direct to your door, of course. Just head to theweek.co.uk/subscribe. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Matt Hill at Rethink Audio. Until we meet again to unwrap next week. Bye-bye.